The first thing that broke through Nazi propaganda was not a tank, a bomber, or a battlefield defeat. It was waste. German prisoners arriving in the United States described American soldiers discarding food, civilians leaving electric lights burning, factories operating through the night, and railway workers using machines for jobs that had demanded far more labor in Germany. For men who had been told that the United States was weak, divided, decadent, and incapable of sustaining a major war, ordinary American excess posed a military question more damaging than any slogan. If this was what the enemy could afford to waste, what could it afford to send to war? That question followed captured German troops from North Africa across the Atlantic and into camps spread across the United States. The surrender in Tunisia in May 1943 had put roughly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers into Allied hands, with totals varying as scattered units continued to capitulate. Many of the Germans had belonged to formations hardened by the North African campaign. They had fought under conditions of fuel shortage, uncertain supply, worn equipment, and shrinking rations. Then captivity exposed them to a different system, one whose power often appeared in mundane things. One account, attributed to a German prisoner waiting in Algeria, describes white bread, coffee, and meat being issued in quantities he had not seen for months. The point is not that every prisoner everywhere ate identically, or that one recollection can establish the daily experience of an entire captive population. The point is what the comparison did. The Germans had just come out of a campaign in which logistics determined what could move, what could fight, and what men could eat. A full plate in an American-run cage was therefore not just comfort, it was a statement about supply. The ships carrying prisoners west reinforced that lesson. Liberty ships were built in numbers the German captives could scarcely reconcile with what they had been told about American industry. One famous production feat in the account is the SS Robert E. Peary, completed in a little more than 4 days. The larger claim matters more than the record-setting example. Thousands of standardized cargo ships were being produced, crewed, loaded, and routed through a global transport network. Ships that had carried material toward the war could return with prisoners rather than sail empty. That was logistics, with very little sentiment in it. Capacity moved both ways. A recollection attributed to a prisoner from the 90th Light Division describes American sailors throwing away partially eaten steaks, bread, and milk. He interpreted the waste as evidence that the supply seemed limitless. The word limitless is his conclusion, not a measurable fact. But I think the detail matters because it exposes the collision between two wartime experiences. One army had been rationing fuel, food, spare parts, and shipping space under severe pressure. The other could apparently tolerate waste aboard a ship that itself belonged to a mass production program. Then came the American coast. At Norfolk, prisoners saw docks, cranes, ships, vehicles, and workers at a scale that the account repeatedly describes as difficult for them to accept. Numbers attached to these scenes are sometimes extremely precise, and without independent comparison, I would not treat every one of them as settled. But the recurring pattern is consistent inside the surviving narrative. The captives noticed not just military equipment, but the supporting economy behind it. They counted cargo vessels. They noticed electrically powered cranes. They noticed civilian cars in worker parking areas. They noticed that ordinary dock laborers possessed consumer goods that had been rare or restricted in Germany. That distinction is crucial. A propaganda system can explain away one enemy weapon. It can call a bomber inferior, a tank crude, or a ship hastily assembled. It is harder to explain away the worker who drives his own car to the yard where the ships are built. The object is civilian. The consequence is military. An economy that can motorize daily life can also motorize armies, distribute parts, move labor, and absorb losses. The railway journey inland sharpened that problem. The prisoners were moved in passenger coaches, rather than the rough troop transport many expected. Accounts describe padded seats, sleeping arrangements, dining cars, and even an American guard apologizing about failed air conditioning. That anecdote is presented as a recollection, so it should remain one. But if the episode occurred as remembered, its psychological power is obvious. A German prisoner did not need an American officer to explain industrial superiority. He could feel it in the coach. The trains also became moving observation platforms. Towns were illuminated at night. Factories continued operating after dark. Workers used mechanized coal loading, powered pumps, and other equipment at railway stops. One prisoner account describes lights left on in empty buildings and fans running in vacant rooms. The writer called the waste magnificent. That is a revealing phrase because it reverses the moral logic of wartime scarcity. What looked irresponsible under one economic system looked like proof of surplus under another. Consider the aircraft plant described near Detroit. The account presents Willow Run as producing B-24 bombers at an extraordinary tempo, with tens of thousands of workers and a huge subcontracting network. A German Luftwaffe pilot is said to have watched aircraft in assembly and rejected the idea that American planes were simply crude products of speed. Whether every detail of that individual recollection can be confirmed is less important than the operational point. Mass production does not need to create a perfect machine. It needs to create enough reliable machines, with crews, fuel, bombs, spare parts, airfields, and maintenance, to keep combat power present. That is where the captive experience becomes more than a story about surprise. The prisoners were witnessing the rear area of a military equation they had already met at the front. In Tunisia, a tank without fuel was not combat power. An aircraft without parts was not combat power. A division without food, trucks, ammunition, and replacements could not remain effective no matter how experienced its soldiers were. In America, the prisoners saw the systems that generated those supporting inputs before they became convoys, depots, squadrons, and armies overseas. I would frame the first major contradiction this way. Nazi propaganda had told them that abundance produced softness. Captivity showed them that abundance could produce endurance. The same society that appeared careless with electricity could keep factories running 3 shifts. The same economy that filled civilian parking lots could produce military vehicles. The same agricultural system that put meat into worker lunches could feed soldiers on another continent. The prisoner did not have to admire the system to understand what it meant. And there is still a caution here. Memoirs and post-war interviews are vulnerable to hindsight. A man writing after Germany's defeat knows who won. He may remember early doubts more sharply than he expressed them at the time. He may compress several experiences into one decisive revelation. A diary written during captivity has different strengths and weaknesses from a recollection written decades later. So when an officer is quoted as saying he first suspected Germany had already lost the war while approaching the American coast, I treat that as his reported memory, not as a stopwatch marking the exact death of his belief. Which carries more weight for you here? The prisoners' reported reactions, or the production and transport systems they were reacting to? Put your answer in the comments, because the difference between memory and measurable capacity changes how this entire experience should be read. The camp system added another layer because it turned national capacity into daily routine. Camp Hearn in Texas is described as containing wooden barracks with electric lighting, toilets, hot showers, heating, a hospital, and a large kitchen. The account presents German medical personnel encountering equipment and drugs that had become difficult to obtain at home. One physician is quoted recalling the use of penicillin even for prisoners. That claim should be read as testimony from the man attributed with it, not as a universal description of medical practice across every camp. But again, the contrast is the story. Enemy captives were seeing scarce medical resources used on them by the state they had been trained to despise. Food produced the same effect. The camp kitchens in the account had refrigeration, powered mixers, dishwashing equipment, and large cooking facilities. A former hotel chef is said to have written that excess bread and food were discarded under provisioning rules. The detail is painful because the comparison was not abstract. German civilians were living under wartime restrictions. The prisoners had families at home. They knew what shortages meant. When a man threw away food in Texas while imagining relatives in Germany, industrial capacity stopped being a chart and became personal. The account repeatedly returns to agriculture. A cotton operation in Texas is described as using machinery that shocked a German observer with how much work it could process in an hour. Farms had electric power, running water, trucks, cars, and tractors. Another captive working in Nebraska wrote about a teenage farm boy handling a tractor whose value seemed extraordinary to him. The American family treated the machine as ordinary. The exact dollar comparison in that recollection cannot be tested from the narrative alone, but the encounter captures a broader military reality. Mechanization substitutes capital and fuel for human labor, and that releases people for other tasks. Near Detroit, captives unloading coal reportedly saw the River Rouge complex and its enormous worker parking areas. One German observer found the cars almost as unsettling as the industrial plant itself. That reaction deserves attention because it reveals a common error in military history. We often separate the battlefield from civilian consumption, as if one represents war and the other represents comfort, but they can emerge from the same productive base. The steel in a family car is not the steel in a tank, yet the ability to make millions of consumer machines requires engineers, machine tools, standardized parts, fuel distribution, roads, repair skills, finance, and labor organization that can be redirected when a country mobilizes. By the winter of 1943, the account says American officials involved in prisoner monitoring noticed a change among some German captives. More men requested newspapers, books, classes, and information about the United States. The narrative calls this an ideological collapse among sections of the prisoner population. That phrase is dramatic, and I would use it carefully. There was no single moment when hundreds of thousands of men abandoned Nazi beliefs together. Captive populations contain committed ideologues, opportunists, apolitical soldiers, anti-Nazis, career officers, conscripts, and men whose views change in different directions. What can be said from the account is narrower and more interesting. Some prisoners reportedly became less willing to repeat claims about imminent German victory. Some camp newspapers shifted toward discussion of politics, economics, and Reconstruction. Educational programs grew. A letter attributed to a captured officer states that he had been taught that America was weak, divided, and incapable of serious military performance, while daily observation suggested the opposite. That is not mass conversion. It is documented dissonance in one man's words. The Italian prisoner experience complicated the comparison further. After Italy's surrender, some Italian captives who cooperated with the United States entered service units with different privileges. German prisoners could watch former allies working under altered conditions. The account attributes to one German a bitter observation that the Italians, despite leaving the Axis partnership, were being treated in ways that challenged what he expected from an enemy power. The political meaning of that scene was harder to dismiss than a factory statistic. It suggested that the American system could differentiate between former enemies, cooperation, and future alignment, rather than treating every defeated man as permanently condemned. Christmas intensified the human contradiction. Civic groups and churches are described as sending packages, cards, food, and other items to German captives. The account reports German-language carols at Camp Hearn and holiday meals so generous that prisoners compared them with what senior figures might have eaten in Germany. Some of those details come through prisoner recollections, and they should stay attached to those recollections. But the underlying tension is unmistakable. The men had been trained in a racial and ideological war. They encountered civilians whose family members could be fighting Germans overseas, yet who still participated in charitable acts toward enemy prisoners. Education programs expanded as the war continued. The account gives figures of tens of thousands of prisoners studying English, American history, mathematics, science, vocational subjects, or other courses. It also describes camp newspapers and university correspondence. One prisoner, identified as a physicist, is said to have attended lectures and to have been impressed that professors, including refugees from Germany, would teach enemy captives. The quoted recollection emphasizes science as something shared across national lines. That memory may be shaped by post-war interpretation, but it fits the larger tension the account is trying to capture. Prisoners who had been told that American society was culturally inferior were being confronted by universities, libraries, journalism, technical instruction, and open disagreement. The economic evidence, meanwhile, kept getting harder to ignore. The account describes prisoners near the Higgins boat operation in New Orleans, watching workers assemble landing craft at high tempo. Women operated cranes and welding equipment. Black workers handled skilled industrial tasks. Teenagers appeared in technical jobs. These observations directly contradicted Nazi racial and social assumptions. The prisoners were not necessarily transformed into liberal Democrats by seeing an integrated production line, and the account should not pretend that social prejudice vanished at the camp gate. But the productive result was in front of them. Categories that Nazi ideology ranked as inferior were participating in an economy generating enormous military output. Then agriculture returned during the 1944 harvest. Prisoners working in the Midwest and California saw mechanized harvesting, grain storage, large farms, and crops that seemed excessive by European wartime standards. One German farmer is reported to have compared the output of a mechanized American farm with the labor of many German farmers. Another account describes fruit being discarded for cosmetic reasons, an act almost incomprehensible to men thinking about shortages at home. I do not need the most extreme production comparison to see why this mattered. To a captive from a rationed society, throwing away edible food could look like proof that the enemy's margin for error was enormous. And a margin for error is a military asset. A country that can replace trucks, produce more aircraft than expected, waste some food, lose cargo, repair damaged machines, and still maintain output has options. A country operating close to the limit has fewer. It must make every shipment count. It must protect scarce specialists. It must decide which front receives fuel and which waits. Industrial war is partly a contest over who can survive mistakes. Normandy gave the prisoners a battlefield demonstration of the system they had been watching from inside America. News of the June 1944 landings reached the camps alongside reports and newsreel images. The account gives familiar large-scale figures for ships, aircraft, troops, and daily supply. It portrays German captives recognizing that the invasion was not simply an attack across a beach. It was the overseas expression of the factories, ports, railroads, fuel systems, shipyards, farms, and worker parking lots they had already seen. That connection is the central operational payoff. The landing craft assembled in American plants were not symbols. They crossed water. The aircraft coming from giant production networks were not abstractions. They flew missions. The grain, meat, fuel, steel, rubber, engines, radios, medical supplies, and trucks moved through chains that ended with armies in Europe. The prisoner who had stared at a mechanized farm or a night shift factory was looking at an early stage of the same force that German units would meet in France. This is also where propaganda's flexibility begins to fail. Before Normandy, a committed believer could argue that American abundance did not equal military competence. He could say the United States had wealth, but lacked courage, organization, battlefield skill, or staying power. After the landings, those escape routes narrowed. The system had projected an army across the Atlantic, supported an amphibious invasion, and sustained expanding operations on the continent. You could still criticize individual weapons or commanders. You could not easily maintain that American productive power was irrelevant to the war. The moral crisis came later and was different. When American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the account says images and reports were shown to German prisoners in the United States. Some initially rejected what they saw as propaganda. The account then describes photographs, newsreels, soldiers' testimony, and letters from Germany, making denial harder. For prisoners who had preserved a distinction between military defeat and national honor, the camp revelations introduced something industrial statistics could not: the question of what they had served. This is the emotional low point, and it should not be romanticized. The account attributes to one prisoner a summary in which he said the men had imagined themselves warriors for a great cause and discovered they had served criminals. That is one man's reported judgment. It cannot speak for every captive. But the contrast between earlier pride and later moral collapse is central to the post-war recollections collected here. If you value military history that separates what people remembered, what they claimed, and what the measurable system could actually do, subscribe and keep following these evidence-first reconstructions. The re-education effort accelerated as defeat became unavoidable. The account describes more prisoners volunteering for courses on democracy, government, economics, and post-war reconstruction. Some officers and specialists reportedly discussed how to use American agricultural or industrial methods when they returned home. Others wanted to remain in the United States, and some later immigrated. These outcomes are often presented as proof that the camp experience converted enemies into Democrats. I would be more precise. The camp experience exposed prisoners to a functioning alternative at the moment their own political system was collapsing militarily and morally. For some men, that exposure clearly mattered. For others, we do not have enough here to say how far beliefs changed. The numbers themselves need similar discipline. One set of figures places the German prisoner population in the United States at 371,683, within a total Axis prisoner population above 425,000. It gives more than 500 camps and branch facilities across most states. It records 2,222 escape attempts, with no permanent successful escape, and describes very large contributions of prisoner labor in agriculture and other sectors. It also gives tens of thousands enrolled in classes, and thousands who later maintained contact with American families. These figures create scale, but they do not automatically prove ideological transformation. The strongest case rests on convergence of different kinds of observation. Prisoners described abundance. They saw mechanization. They encountered civilian consumption. They worked on farms. They passed factories. They received food and medical care. They read newspapers. They watched films. They took classes. They observed social groups participating in production in ways Nazi ideology had treated as signs of weakness. Then they watched American military power expand in Europe. The chain from civilian capacity to battlefield consequence was visible from both ends. That is why the most memorable objects in this story are ordinary ones. A light bulb left burning, a worker's automobile, a hamburger, a tractor, a refrigerated kitchen, a powered crane. None of them can win a battle alone, but each is connected to a system of electricity, oil, roads, factories, farms, transport, wages, parts, technical skills, and institutions. The prisoners had been trained to measure national strength through race, obedience, martial tradition, and conquest. America confronted them with a different measurement: output. There is an irony here that deserves more than a slogan. Nazi Germany had celebrated mobilization, discipline, sacrifice, and the subordination of civilian life to war. The United States could look comparatively loose, consumerist, noisy, and wasteful. Yet the very civilian economy that appeared undisciplined generated an enormous reserve of productive capacity. The Americans did not have to eliminate ordinary life completely to wage industrial war. A factory worker could own a car, drink a soft drink, listen to a radio, and still participate in production that supplied a global military effort. But selected evidence can still destroy a bad theory. If a man has been told that every small American town is collapsing, one electrified town may be dismissed. If he sees town after town after town, the explanation gets harder. If he has been told American workers lack discipline, one factory may be called a showpiece. If he passes multiple plants and later works near others, the showpiece theory weakens. If he has been told American aircraft are crude, one airplane proves little. If the sky over Europe fills with them, the argument changes. The account's most aggressive claim is that American prosperity itself defeated Nazi ideology among the prisoners. That is too broad if treated as a universal fact. The camp population was not one mind, nor can post-war West Germany's reconstruction be reduced to former prisoners bringing home lessons from Texas, Nebraska, or Oklahoma. The reconstruction of Germany involved occupation policy, German institutions, political choices, international aid, industrial recovery, the Cold War, and many other forces not developed in this account. So I would not claim that POW camps created the economic recovery of the 1950s. Repatriation, therefore, carried more than bodies back to Germany. The men returned with memories, comparisons, technical observations, relationships, resentments, admiration, shame, and arguments. They returned to a country physically damaged and politically broken. Some had seen how American farms used machinery. Some had worked in food plants. Some had learned English. Some had read newspapers unavailable under Nazi censorship. Some had received treatment from enemy doctors. Some had watched concentration camp images while still behind American wire. The most careful post-war conclusion is not that every prisoner became a convinced Democrat. It is that captivity created conditions in which Nazi claims could be tested against repeated observation. That is rare. Propaganda normally tries to control the comparison set. The prisoners lost that protection. For years, Nazi messaging had offered explanations for American weakness. A heterogeneous population supposedly meant disunity. Consumer culture supposedly meant decadence. Parliamentary government supposedly meant indecision. High living standards supposedly meant softness. Racial hierarchy supposedly produced strength. Captivity placed those claims beside factories, farms, docks, universities, military bases, newspapers, and the treatment of prisoners. The men could judge for themselves, imperfectly and from a restricted position, but with far more information than they had possessed before capture. That combination appears repeatedly in the prisoners' remembered language. American guards were part of a system capable of defeating Germany, yet individual captives describe apologies, medical care, classes, religious charity, and ordinary conversation. They also describe fences, rules, labor, censorship of correspondence, and the reality of captivity. The relationship was never equal. The prisoners were enemy soldiers under control. But power did not have to present itself as constant humiliation. The Geneva Convention framework matters here because humane treatment was not simply spontaneous kindness. It was also policy, law, administration, and military discipline. The account describes identity processing, medical examinations, inoculations, explanations of rights, camp construction, labor allocation, and educational programs. That bureaucratic side is easy to overlook because it lacks dramatic imagery. Yet administration is another form of capacity. An army that can capture hundreds of thousands of men also has to feed them, guard them, move them, classify them, provide medical care, assign labor, handle mail, and eventually repatriate them. Think about the scale for a moment. Handling prisoners is a burden. They consume transport space, food, guards, construction material, medical supplies, paperwork, and command attention. They do not directly increase combat strength unless their labor releases other workers. The United States was able to absorb that burden while fighting overseas. That does not prove infinite resources. Nothing is infinite. It demonstrates spare organizational capacity. The 2,222 escape attempts in the figures given in the account make another useful point. The dramatic image of a POW camp often centers on escape, but the American geography changed the calculation. A German prisoner who crossed a fence still faced immense distance, unfamiliar terrain, a foreign language environment, and an ocean between himself and Germany. Most escapees were recaptured, the account says, often quickly. The low number of permanent successes therefore reveals less about prisoner happiness than about the strategic reality of captivity in North America. Distance was itself a weapon. No German armored thrust could reach Texas. No Luftwaffe raid could open a camp in Nebraska. No nearby neutral border offered an easy route home. The prisoners were physically removed from the European battlefield and placed inside the economy their government had underestimated. That combination made the United States almost a controlled experiment. In comparison, they were safe from the front, unable to return to Germany, and surrounded by evidence of the enemy's productive base. There is another reason the industrial scenes mattered so much. Many of these prisoners had professional knowledge. Factory workers, engineers, farmers, chemists, pilots, doctors, and skilled tradesmen did not view American machinery as tourists. They had reference points from their own lives. A chemist could recognize a processing plant. A pilot could evaluate aircraft construction. A farmer could understand what a combine replaced. A doctor could recognize equipment and medicine. An electrical worker could understand what widespread power distribution implied. One of the most useful examples is rubber. The account describes prisoners passing a synthetic rubber complex and comparing its output with German production. Germany had significant technical experience with synthetic substitutes because access to natural resources was constrained. The United States, facing wartime shortages of natural rubber, built a large synthetic program. The exact plant-by-plant numbers in the narrative would need independent verification before I treated them as final. But a German chemist, recognizing the industrial scale of a substitute material program, would have understood the strategic meaning immediately. Resource denial works differently against an economy that can invent, finance, and mass-produce replacements. The same logic applies to shipping. A submarine can sink a cargo ship. The strategic question is whether the enemy can replace ships, crews, and cargo faster than losses destroy the transport system. Liberty ship production mattered not, because any individual ship was extraordinary in combat. It mattered because standardized construction turned shipbuilding into a contest of rates. German prisoners crossing the Atlantic inside that system were literally being transported by the replacement capacity their own side needed to defeat. The prisoners also saw that industrial power was geographically distributed. Shipyards on the coasts, aircraft plants in the Midwest, steel in the industrial belt, farms across the plains, ports on rivers and oceans, electric generation across regions, food processing near agricultural production. No single bombing campaign from Europe could reach all of it. Germany had faced bombing of its own concentrated industrial cities. American production benefited from continental depth. The prisoners experienced that depth by rail, mile after mile. This is where the repeated image of electric light becomes more than scenery. Electricity was the common denominator. factories, refrigeration, pumps, machine tools, lighting, communications, food processing, and domestic appliances all depended on power generation and distribution. A prisoner who noticed rural electrification was noticing infrastructure. He may not have had a national statistical table, but he could see wires, motors, illuminated towns, and machines. A light bulb does not look like a weapon, but the grid behind it can run the factory that makes one. That is the kind of relationship I think these accounts reveal best. They are strongest when they show the prisoners making connections between civilian systems and military outcomes. They are weakest when a later recollection tries to compress an enormous political transformation into one perfect sentence. The historical value is in the accumulation, not the neatness. The account says American authorities provided vocational and political preparation before repatriation. Some prisoners reportedly learned agricultural methods or studied democratic government. The narrative also claims that thousands later kept correspondence with American families, and that some immigrated to the United States in the 1950s. Those later relationships matter because they show captivity could produce ties that survived the war, though again, they do not tell us what every former prisoner believed. Post-war reunions became another arena where memory was organized. The account describes a 1985 gathering in Texas attended by former German prisoners who returned with families. Speeches attributed to participants emphasize material abundance, personal dignity, and changed political beliefs. Reunion speeches are not neutral wartime diaries. They are retrospective, ceremonial, and shaped by 40 years of alliance between West Germany and the United States. That context matters. A former prisoner speaking in 1985 is remembering 1943 through everything that happened afterward. Yet retrospective memory is still historical evidence when treated as retrospective memory. It tells us how these men chose to interpret captivity later. The repeated themes are notable: food, running water, heating, farm machinery, civilian kindness, industrial scale, and the collapse of expectations. The same ordinary objects keep resurfacing because they were easy to remember and easy to compare. I would not call that accidental. The human mind often understands national power through tangible examples. A statistic about millions of tons of steel is abstract. A worker throwing away a half-finished meal is immediate. A chart showing generating capacity is abstract. A farmhouse lit at night is immediate. A production curve for mechanized agriculture is abstract. A 16-year-old driving a tractor is immediate. Those images also explain why a propaganda system built on caricature can fail so quickly when physical comparison becomes unavoidable. The caricature said, "America was decadent." The prisoner saw production. The caricature said, "Americans were disorganized." The prisoner saw transport schedules, camp administration, factories, and ports. The caricature said, "A mixed society could not mobilize effectively." The prisoner saw women and black workers operating industrial equipment. The caricature said, "Democracy produced weakness." The prisoner watched the democratic state project armies across oceans. The conclusion should still be measured. American capacity did not win the war alone. Soviet armies, British power, Allied cooperation, resistance movements, German strategic decisions, resource shortages, intelligence, naval warfare, air power, battlefield losses, and many other forces determined the outcome. This account is not a complete explanation of Allied victory. It is a focused window into what German prisoners in America reportedly noticed once they were removed from the front. Inside that window, however, the pattern is powerful. Their most consequential lesson was not simply that America had more. It was that abundance had been organized. Resources had become electricity. Electricity had become machine hours. Machine hours had become ships, aircraft, processed food, vehicles, medical supplies, and landing craft. transport turned those products into overseas force. Administration sustained both armies and prisoners. Political institutions proved capable of mobilizing on a scale Nazi propaganda had said they could not. For men coming from a system that glorified conquest as the route to national greatness, that alternative was hard to ignore. American wealth had not been acquired through German-style territorial expansion in Europe. It existed before the prisoners arrived, and wartime mobilization converted it into power. The captive could disagree with American politics, dislike his guards, remain loyal to Germany, or cling to racial beliefs. Yet the factory still ran, the trains still moved, the farms still produced, the lights still burned. That last image brings the loop back to its most useful question, not because electric light is sentimental, but because it compresses the entire system into something one man could see through a train window. If these accounts matter to you, keep this channel in your rotation and keep testing the claims against the physical evidence. A German prisoner, looking across an American town at night, did not need to know the final production totals. He only needed to compare that illuminated street with the darkness and restrictions he remembered at home. The comparison did not prove every American boast. It did something narrower. It made the old explanation harder to sustain. And once that happened, the smallest signs of surplus began to carry strategic meaning, especially the things Americans seemed able to waste.